Welcome to the UI experience.
And a pleasant good afternoon to the UI Nation, to those who are listening on the internet throughout the United States and all over the world. This is Real Talk with Brother Jalal Tariq, and obviously you can hear that I am not Brother Jalal Tariq. I'm one of his co-hosts, Brother Terry Banks, and I'll be sitting in for Jalal as he takes care of other business today. And we're going to get this show right on moving. This is going to be one we would like very much for you to be a part of the conversation, but if you're more comfortable just sitting back and listening, by all means, you are welcome to do that as well. I thought about some of the conversations that we had in the past couple of days, and it triggered me to think about the subject matter for today. And we talked about race neutrality in one of our previous shows, and is it a good thing to raise our children to be colorblind? We dealt with that issue, and it got pretty strong, pretty heated. And we also dealt with black pathology and just the fact that, you know, how black men are perceived and blacks in general are perceived. And it just made me think about what really led to us even having these conversations in the first place. And what that dealt with was a subject matter that we're going to deal with today, and it's going to pose a question. And so I'm going to first give you some background information on what this is. And then, of course, if you are aware of it, that's a good thing. But I always like to believe that people may not be as aware as what they think they are. And I'm going to just give you the background information. We're going to talk about Jim Crow. And if you don't know what Jim Crow is, it may be because you probably lived in another country and you're just getting here to America. But Jim Crow here in America is what apartheid was in South Africa. And it is what Aryan supremacy's thought processes were when Adolf Hitler was running Germany. It believes that there is one race of people, the white race, that are superior above all other races, and that all other races are supposed to be underneath them. And so Jim Crow here in America created a certain amount of laws and put something in place that we are actually still dealing with today. So Jim Crow itself was not exclusively in just the southern border states, although it was heavily in the southern states here in the United States. So between 1865, when Abraham Lincoln supposedly, as you hear that quote all the time, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, which we know he did not. So between that time and the mid-1960s, Jim Crow was what's more than just a series of rigid anti-black laws. Jim Crow was a way of life, people, period. Under Jim Crow, we African Americans were relegated to the status of second-class citizens. And Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-black racism. And even back then, many white Christian ministers, these are men who believed they really knew what God was about. Many of these ministers and theologians taught that whites were the chosen people, that we blacks, or we African Americans, we were cursed to be servants, and that God actually supported racial segregation. Now, I wouldn't care who you were to ask. You can ask craniologists, eugenicists, phrenologists. You can ask social Darwinists. You can ask John Smith at the corner bar. It wouldn't matter. If they were white, they believed this. And they clearly believed that at every level that we were inferior to whites. Now, if you look at pro-segregation politicians, they gave all these fabulous speeches on the great dangers of integration, and they were warning white people what would happen if you allow black people to really be a part of the society in an equal basis. And what they felt was going to happen is that the race would become mongrelized, that the white race would suddenly become a mongrel race. And even newspaper and magazine writers, which is why I always tell people that, having worked in the media, I know firsthand that the media slants all of its views against blacks, and that they usually they do a story suggesting that blacks are on the bad side of that story. It's negative writing. So even back then, they would write in their papers about us, and they would refer to us as niggers and coons and darkies. And even worse, these articles actually reinforced the anti-black stereotypes. Even when it came to games that children played, they portrayed us as inferior images. So every major societal institution that existed in the United States of America reflected and supported the oppression of us. Now, the system itself was undergirded by these following beliefs or these rationalizations. First, that whites were superior to blacks in all important ways, including but not limited to our intelligence, our morality, our civilized behavior, sexual relations between blacks and whites, which they believe would produce a mongrel race that would ultimately destroy America. And of course, treating blacks as equals would encourage interracial sexual union, so they wanted none of that. And any activity which suggested social equality encouraged this type of act, and they didn't want that, so they wanted to be sure that violence would have to be used if necessary to keep us at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Now, I'm going to give you some examples, again, of just how ridiculously ignorant this was, which when I pose the question to you, it's going to really make you see that it's a legitimate question. These norms under Jim Crow, these etiquette norms, meant that as a black man, I couldn't offer my hand or even shake hands with a white person because it would imply that we are socially equal. So I couldn't shake his hand if I met him. And obviously a black man couldn't offer his hand or anything else to a white woman because you clearly were going to be hung if you did so. When it came to eating together, blacks and whites were not supposed to eat together. If we did, then whites were to be served first. And if somehow we wound up in the same room or the same building eating together, then some sort of partition was to be placed between us so that we weren't anywhere close to each other while we were eating. This is food we're talking about. Under no circumstances was a black male to offer to even light a cigarette of a white female. The reason why is because that gesture would imply intimacy. And God forbid you try to get intimate with a white person. We were not allowed to show public affection towards one another in public, especially kissing, because this offended whites. Now, let's listen to that. I'm black. My wife is black. We're walking down the street in 1895, and we decide we want to just give an affectionate kiss to each other. We were not allowed to do that in public because a white person may be offended by it, so we can't even show love to each other. This was a part of the Jim Crow etiquette. It also prescribed that blacks were to be introduced to whites, but never were you to introduce a white person to a black person. Let me give you an example. Let's say Mr. Peters, he's the white guy, and I'm Terry, I'm the black guy. It would be, well, Mr. Peters, this is Terry, the black guy I told you about. But it could never be the other way around to imply that somehow I am important enough to introduce to Mr. Peters in the first place. See how silly this is getting? But this is actually what was in place. Whites also did not use courtesy titles of respect when they referred to us. For example, we were never called Mr., Mrs., Sir, or Ma'am. Instead, we were called by our first names or, of course, by all of the negative names that they referred to us as: nigger, darky, coon, and particularly boy. I mean, white men loved to call black men boy. As disrespectful a term to me as the word nigger. Also, we had to use courtesy titles when we referred to them. So when you're addressing them, you better not call them anything else but by their Mr., Ms., Sir, Madam name before you even address them. If we rode in a car that was driven by a white person, you'd have to ride in the back seat or in the back of a truck. And one of the silliest rules was that when horse and carriages were around, and even at the start of when motor vehicles were around, white motorists had the right of way at all intersections. Could you imagine the traffic jams and the accidents that would cause if we tried to do that today? Look over and see, is it a white person in the car next to you before you decide if you can proceed? How ignorant is that? But these were actual laws that were put in place as a result of Jim Crow. You know, there were some simple rules that were observed when you dealt with whites. You were never to assert or even intimate that a white person is lying. You were never to impute dishonorable intentions to a white person. You couldn't suggest or even admit out loud that you thought a white person is from an inferior class. You couldn't lay claim to, nor could you overly demonstrate that you had superior knowledge or intelligence over a white person. You were never to curse at them. You were never to laugh at them or make fun of them. And you never could comment on the appearance of a white female. You see the problem that this is causing? Now, this is how we got started when we got here as a race. already being told that we are to be under this particular group of people. And these people would do anything in their power to make sure that we stayed under them. So if you think about how that is translated now into 2014, not very much has changed. Some of the silly laws, like the one about right of way for white people, that may have changed, but we still are under the same Jim Crow system that would not allow for us to really be fairly equal to them. So the question would be, are we still feeling the effects of Jim Crow today in 2014? And if we are, how so? And if we are not, as Stacey Dash and other black folks would have you believe, how not so? So, Brother Patrick, having set that stage for you, I definitely need you to chime in and give me your opinion of what you think about this Jim Crow law, the etiquette, and where we stand with it today.
Well, I definitely feel like we're still dealing with Jim Crow, and we're still dealing with a lot of the, not the direct, overt things, but like for me, what has happened is you had the segregation of the South, and then that was, for the most part, written into law. And then you had the de facto segregation of the North, which, even though it was similar to what was going on in the South, it wasn't necessarily written in the law so much as it was just written in the codes of conduct and culture. That mentality of the North has just kind of spread out all over the country, where the laws were repealed, but the culture and the mind states that were ingrained and that were stationed under the title of the Jim Crow umbrella were never really dealt with. They were never really removed, and people are fighting tooth and nail not to really have to look at them. When you go into most major cities, you'll find that largely the educational system, despite the great desegregation, is still segregated. Black schools are still predominantly black kids. White schools are still predominantly white kids. Hispanic schools are now predominantly Hispanic kids. And as a matter of fact, now that we're talking about that, strictly Spanish-only speaking schools are springing up all over the country. So, there has been no desegregation. Office workplaces are still largely segregated. And even in places where they aren't, there's been study after study from numerous states. The one that pops into my head right now is a study done in Tennessee that directly correlated the morale of the white workers to how many black people actually work there. The more black people that were employed in their office space, the lower their morale was. And you have all of these different things that are still showing signs and symptoms of racism. The fact that people don't want to hire somebody who has a traditionally black sounding name because of all of these racial stereotypes that they believe are going to come into the office place because of that person, or the culture they think that person might bring into the office place, or the fact that they don't want to make their workers feel uncomfortable not knowing how to say the name properly. To me, that screams Jim Crow segregation when you think about the fact that I believe it was in the late 1800s. No, I think it was the early 1900s, I mean to say, around about 1910, 1920, somewhere in between there, where it became illegal. A law was written to make it illegal, or acceptable, should I say, to segregate federal workplaces. And some of them went so far as to require you to submit a picture with your job application to get a federal job. Those types of things, because of the stereotype being pushed in about what black people were and what black people would bring to the office place. Those things still exist to this very day. That's why we have studies like the one coming out of Stanford that says a black person will have to wait on average 5 weeks longer to get a call back for a job than a white person. Not to mention the different studies that have shown that black people have to be more qualified, more educated to achieve the same level of status as a less educated or less qualified peer. When you look at unemployment numbers, black people with bachelor's degrees have the same employment numbers as white people with high school diplomas. And as you go up, you go up. Black people with PhDs have the same employment numbers as white people with master's degrees. So you're constantly seeing this theme of black people having to go above and beyond in order to achieve the same thing that they're achieving. I mean, and even to the point that we call it Jim Crow. When you look at one of the native forms of entertainment to come out of America, which America hasn't been highly original in too much of anything, but the few things they did originate were all highly racist and highly negative towards black people. I mean, Jim Crow was a white man who pretty much was the godfather of minstrel shows. He made all his fame and riches off picking on black people, dressing up in blackface, burnt coal on his face, pretending to be a fool, jucking, jiving, dancing, idiot fool. He also created characters called Sambos, Coons, and Dandies. This is where all of these negative terms come from. They all stem from the image that was destroyed during Jim Crow segregation. So even if legally we aren't dealing with the same problems, and even if socially we have addressed a lot of the issues we face in America today, culturally and institutionally we haven't checked our progress. And largely we haven't checked our progress institutionally because we refuse to address the culture of white supremacy, and it's been allowed to go underground, and it's been allowed to manifest itself in very subtle ways. So instead of them saying, I don't like working with black people, now they can say working with black people makes me uncomfortable. And they have all of these other things that they can layer under that, and you even have other black people co-signing it, Well, yeah, it should make you uncomfortable because black people sell drugs and kill other people. Well, hold on a second. White people kill just as many, if not more people than black people do. Matter of fact, you're more likely to get killed at work by a white person than a black person. So why is that coming into question when you start talking about hiring a black person to work at your job? You're more likely to have white-collar crimes happen from white people than black people. Now, that's largely because white people have most of those jobs. But still, that should be something that would have people say, well, if I'm going to hire an accountant or somebody to manage my funds or whatever the case may be, I have a better chance of it being stolen by a white person than the black person. So shouldn't I want to hire a black person? But that's when the culture kicks in and starts to paint this negative imagery. So for me, like I said earlier, not to go in circles or to beat a dead horse, but my personal belief is even though we've dealt with the legality of Jim Crow, we haven't dealt with the cultural aspect of it. We haven't dealt with the mind states that drive this type of culture, and we never will deal with the remaining and lasting effects of Jim Crow and white supremacy until we start to check the culture itself. And don't ask me when we're going to do that, because the last conversation I had with a black person about black people in America, they told me, what did they say? Mike Brown deserved to be killed because he didn't have no business walking through the middle of the street. That's what uncivilized, brutish people do. And the cop was probably scared. He a big old 200-pound black man. He need to be shot because he could hurt somebody. Like those were words from a black person. So I have no idea when we're going to come around to addressing this issue, but we definitely need to address it.
No question about it. And as a matter of fact, when we talked about codes of conduct and culture, these laws were put in place to make white people comfortable. That's what they were put in place for, so that they could exist and feel as though at any place I go and whatever I do, I am always going to be number one and I'm always going to be safe. So this is why they decided to do this anyway. Now, what I look at this as psychopathic fears. They're psychopathic fears that white people have about Negroes, and particularly us Negro men, where they look at how we're built, they look at how we sound, they look at the fact that we're dark, and we simply look terrifying to them. So when they started doing these lynchings, to me, these were terrorist acts in the same way that 9/11 was a terrorist act. And white folks always want you to never, ever, ever forget what happened on 9/11, which was September 11th, 2001. Well, why would you expect me to forget all of the lynchings that you committed against us? Not only in 9/11, but let's go to 1919. Let's go to 1898. Let's go to 1906. Let's go to 1908. How about 1917? What about 1921? Let's go up to 1943. How about 1947 in Sikeston, Missouri, where I was born, where you lynched Cleo Wright and hooked him up to the back of your truck and drug him all through town? How about the racial violence in 1976? Come on. This is such a ridiculous argument to believe that white people think that we're supposed to forget and move on and just never, ever act as if our black ancestors weren't hung from trees. And let's look at what they did. When we talked about lynching, this served many purposes. Number one, it was actually cheap entertainment for them. I mean, they would come to these for entertainment. It served as their uniting point. Let's go and attack all of these black folks. Let's make ourselves feel as though we are dominant. And the lynch mobs directed their hate usually against one person, but they would always bring 100 or 200 people to come after just one black person. Just one. And when they would do it, they would have to give themselves some kind of excuse. So they would say, well, it's because he looked at a white woman or because he tried to take a white man's job. And this was their reason for murdering us. When you think about these acts of terror, these were massacres. These were mass lynchings. And what they would do is would bring their children. This is what, again, makes me always ask myself internally, is there something inherently evil in these people? To bring your children to watch you burn a black body alive and to watch you castrate that black body. And then you cut off body parts and you give them to your kids as souvenirs. And yet we're supposed to believe that you are superior to us in the way that you behave as a human being. It doesn't work for me. And this is why I always question, are these people really just inherently evil? Because you will not find any place in the United States of America where blacks went around lynching whites like that. Never. And I dare anyone to show me where you just say, yeah, here's where it happened. There every single day, they were going out and finding white people and lynching them and hanging them from trees. You're not going to find that. Because number one, we just were not going to participate in burning people alive. We weren't going to participate in bringing our kids and cut people's testicles off and celebrate this. But this is what they did. Now, here's the other thing. When we talk about the police and the fact that the police are running around here shooting black men down for no reason, this goes back to Jim Crow. This is why it's built into the police department to look at black people as if they are the problem. The police force, more than any other institution, was invariably involved as a precipitating cause or a perpetrating factor in these riots. Because in every one of these riots that took place, the police actually sided with the attackers, or they actually participated in the attacks, or they stood by and let the attacks happen. This is the police we're talking about, supposed to protect and serve. Yet every time black people were being attacked, they would stand by and do nothing. So here we are in 2014. Let me just use one, for example, the Oklahoma riots of 1921, where they went and burned down a whole town of successful black folks simply because they were jealous of the fact that these black people are holding their own. Now, this makes me, it really, when I say sick to my stomach, it starts to bother me inside of my stomach when I really think about what they did this for. They didn't do this because black people said, we're going to move next door to you. They had their own black community. They didn't do this because black people say, you know what, we're going to run you white folks out of town. They didn't do this because black kids were running over to white folks' houses wanting to intermarry with their children. They did this because those black people became successful. They had their own banks, their own stores. They were shopping and dealing and educating their own children, dressing very well, and minding their own business. And they just took it upon themselves to say, you know what? Let's go. Let's do these niggers. You know, you just for no reason, dude. These niggers. Let's go stop these niggers. They think they're getting too uppity. So where in Jim Crow were we ever supposed to be able to be equal? Where was the fairness ever supposed to come in? Because you're telling us in 2014 that we're supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and not ask you for anything. But then once we are at that same level, it bothers you. So you're going to try to figure out a way to knock us back down to where we are underneath you again. So we're dealing with this in 2014 just as they dealt with it in 1921, just as they dealt with it in East St. Louis in 1917, just as they did this when they had mass lynchings in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, you know, in Gary, Indiana when it was founded in 1908. I mean, they were still killing and lynching and murdering us for no reason. As a matter of fact, let me point this out. James Weldon Johnson, and if anybody doesn't know who he is, he's a black writer. In 1919, he labeled that summer as the Red Summer. And he did that because of all of the racial tension that was going on all across the United States of America. And remember, 1919 was just after World War I. So black men had gone out of the house, went and fought for the United States of America in the war. And when they came back, they felt, hey, maybe, you know, this is the chance for them to see. We want to be even. We want to be fair. You know, let us participate in society. And so when we try to get jobs, when we tried to move forward, try to educate our kids, it just made white people mad. So in Chicago, Knoxville, Nashville, Charleston, Omaha, Nebraska, and in 24 other cities, white folks went crazy. And they just started lynching and killing and burning black people. Soldiers, didn't matter. Kids, women, it didn't matter. They would just run around killing. And they were doing this for one reason, because black folks had fought in the war and came back and just wanted an opportunity to participate in society on an even basis. This was their rationale for killing us. So when I look at white people again, I know some of the ones today are beautiful people and they'll hold hands with you and sing Kumbaya, and that's good. All right, that's fine. We appreciate that. That's nice. But the overwhelming majority would just as soon be the ones who were just like their ancestors were and see both you and I swing from trees as opposed to be here on this radio show talking. They would want us to shine their boots for them. They would want us to drive their cars for them. They would want us to serve them. They would not want us to be able to speak out as we're doing now. So I personally don't feel that we have moved very far from the effects of Jim Crow. Now, my next question to you is, let's take a person like Stacey Dash, because, again, we talked about her in one of the shows, and it irritated me when Brother Jalal brought her name up, because she works for Fox, this conservative news station that clearly is not in any way for the betterment of black folks in any way possible. She decides to work for them, and she makes these stupid comments about people in Louisiana talking about they deserve to be poor. It's their fault that they're uneducated. These people just need to stop begging white people for money, and just all these derogatory remarks that she's making. A person like her would believe that we are not feeling the effects of Jim Crow. How do people like Stacey Dash come up with her mentality, yet a person like Terry Banks has his mentality? Why such a difference?
I think it's largely ignorance. I mean, I think somebody like a Stacey Dash, who, if you follow her career in any way, shape, form, or fashion, you'll see she's never really challenged the status quo. She's never really been someone to go against the grain or to define herself. Like, after we had that talk, I went and tried to find instances of her even making a statement about being black, and I couldn't find anything. So you have people that will fly largely under the radar, and they will achieve some level of success, be it in the form of fame or be it in the form of a limited fortune, or whatever the case may be. But in a lot of cases, you have these blacks who have achieved whatever success that they're going to achieve because they've chosen to be what we would term as coons or sellouts, because they've chosen, if you look at, I forget the name of the pastor that went from nobody to somebody on Fox News all overnight because he spoke out against the black people in Ferguson, and then he issued an apology to white America.
I tell you what, let me cut in for just a second. Your microphone, you're breaking up just a little bit, where there's a little bit of distortion in your voice, and I want the people to be able to hear your points clearly.
Okay, let me. Am I still breaking up?
Now you're good.
Okay.
Okay, continue on.
And actually, that's good because it gave me a chance to remember the guy's name, Jonathan Gentry.
Okay, now you're distorted again.
Well, that sucks.
Yeah.
Jonathan Gentry.
There we go. That's clear.
Okay. Jonathan Gentry is the black pastor who issued the apology to white America on behalf of black America because of what was going on in Ferguson. And all of a sudden, he's a Fox News regular contributor or correspondent for a couple other places, all of a sudden. So you also have to look at these black people who achieve what they've achieved because they choose to be Sambos and sellouts and coons and this, that, and the third. And those people you just kind of have to do away with. They've deemed that their own personal success is more important than any group success or any group civil liberties or human rights or anything like that. They're all about them. But then you also have these people who are simply ignorant. And Stacey Dash might fall into both categories. They're simply ignorant because the way racism works nowadays, if it's not explained to you, if you don't really understand what's happening, then everything gets chalked up underneath the guise of life is not fair. Some people make it, some people don't. And that's true. Life isn't fair. But when we start talking about racism, there's a distinct difference between institutional racism and cultural and social barriers being placed in front of you and the barriers of life being placed in front of you. Like, there's a distinct difference. But if you don't know any better, if you don't look at the numbers, if you don't get a total picture, then you will assume that I made it or the roadblocks that are in front of me that I hurdle are similar to the roadblocks that everybody has to hurdle. And if you've had to hurdle more roadblocks than anybody else, then you would just assume that everybody else has had to hurdle a lot as well. It's not until you begin to look at the total picture that you can begin to say, well, wait a second. On average, black people have to jump twice as many hurdles, and the hurdles are like 2 notches higher than white people have to jump to cover the same distance. That's when you begin to say racism is at work here, because then you begin to look and see, well, who put the hurdles there? Are the hurdles inherent in the structure of society? Are the hurdles inherent in the structure of society for me? Are they cultural hurdles or are they societal hurdles? If they're cultural hurdles, is my society the dominant society, or is my culture the dominant culture in this society, or is my culture one of the lesser or minority cultures in this society? You begin to have to look at how your culture is ranked in society, who's laying out the hurdles, what the hurdles are. Once you can begin to really see those pictures, you can begin to really assess what's going on. But if you're ignorant to what's happened, like you said, you don't know about the 1898 destruction of Wilmington, where they still don't have an adequate count of how many people actually died. All started because basically, there was a bunch of different things going into it, but the spark that lit the fuse was basically a black man, a newspaper owner. He owned his own medium, wrote something in his paper about a white woman. And the white men decided to get up in arms, and they decided to kill and murder and maim and burn and everything else. You don't know about what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You don't know about Detroit. You don't know about Oakland or L.A. You don't know about all these instances where you see, a lot of people, they don't know about the whole gator bait thing. Now we think gator bait is just school in Florida, the Florida Gators. Let's do the gator chomp. Not realizing that when some people say gator bait, they meant black babies being used as gator bait. They don't know that. They don't know about the slave skin wallets or the the dexterity balls made out of slave testicles. They don't know about these types of things, and they don't know about the mind state that goes into developing sick and twisted endeavors like that, all because you feel like you're superior because something else is different. And so if you don't really understand, nobody's ever really told you about these things, then you'll go through life thinking everybody has hurdles, everybody has roadblocks, which is true. Personal responsibility is very real. Never want to discount that. But if you're never told about these things, then you don't see the other side of personal responsibility, which is social responsibility. True enough, you have to carry your weight. You have to do what you have to do, even when society doesn't. But there still has to be a role played by society, by the group, by the culture, the large dominant culture within which you live, to make sure that, okay, if I do everything that I'm supposed to do personally, I will end up where I'm supposed to end up. And basically, when I say racism anyways, when I talk white supremacy, when I talk these things, that's what I'm speaking of. The fairness and opportunity between whites and blacks. Not the fairness and opportunity, period, because I know opportunity isn't necessarily fair, but the fairness and opportunity between whites and blacks. And it's very easy if you're ignorant or if you're a psychopath or a sociopath to not see the glaring and very apparent disparities and inequalities between the availability of opportunities. I was on already. I'm gonna end it real quick. And there are psychopaths out there. For people that don't believe this, there are some people that believe that if everybody knew, everybody would care. That's simply not true. I was on a radio show a couple weeks back being interviewed for something, and a white guy called in, and we talked extensively with this guy. It was probably a 30-40 minute conversation of a 2-hour show where I talked with this guy, and after he had finally accepted everything I had said and finally said, well, you know what, you might be right, and you know what, I Googled some of the stuff you said and it seems to be true, but life's not fair, tough shit. I don't care about the struggles of black people. I don't. So you guys, if you got to work twice as hard, then fuck it, work twice as hard. I don't see what you're complaining about. Like, these were his words to me. I don't care about the inequality. It doesn't bother me, so I don't care. Those are the types of mindsets that we're having to deal with, both from white and black people. So, you know, I don't think we should get too hung up on you have a lot of groups that are so busy trying to convert. And this might be a little off topic for some, but trust me, it relates. I don't think we should get too hung up on trying to awaken the unconscious. You know, I treat everybody like everybody's seen The Matrix. We know. I treat everybody like like we're all in the Matrix, and anybody at any given point in time could become an agent because they want the system to exist because it's all they know, and they're just trying to get into a better position in the system, and they'll fight you tooth and nail to preserve the system. I don't worry about them. And you see, in The Matrix, Morpheus and all those other guys wasn't trying to unplug everybody they met. They were working on the system itself. That's what those that are conscious have to do. We have to work on the system ourselves. We can't get bogged down with a Stacey Dash, because she'll have you thinking you're crazy. And the next thing you know, you're useless. So, you know, I'm going to end it with that. But that's my personal thoughts on all that. There was an answer in there somewhere. I get a little passionate, and I start going. But well, I know there was an answer in there somewhere.
And the answer is there. And what the answer was that the answer is yes, we are still feeling the effects of Jim Crow. And every example that you gave points that out. When you have people that say, I don't care about the plight of black people and what they had to go through and where you stand now that is Jim Crow still in effect. That is that person's ancestors who were white saying, we're going to be this way, we're going to pass this down to our kids, and they're going to pass it down to their kids, and they're going to pass it down to their kids, and they're going to pass it down to their kids. So that's what he is. He is their kids, their kids, their kids, their kids. Mm-hmm. You see, he's that person. So we're never, ever, ever, and I'm always going to say this until my time comes to leave this earth, we are never, ever going to have the majority of white people ever want us to be even, equal, or participating fairly in this society with them. So they're always going to find some way to subject you, some way to blame you. And as I said, you look at the police now, that's where the attack is coming from. The police are leading the attack and finding reasons to kill black men for no reason. Now, again, I could see if you had an absolute reason. This black person has a gun. He is going around town just killing people for no reason, and you had to kill him. That's a reason. But when they're stopping at a gas station to get gas, and you pull him over and ask him to go get his ID, and he reaches for his ID, and you shoot him, that is not a reason, period. That is your white fear. That is your psychopathic fear as a white person coming out in your duties as a police officer. And far too much of that is going on. Having said that, so we're going to move on to this next subject real quick, and it actually is along the lines of Jim Crow and the effects of it. Now, this one came up because I was thinking about something I always say, and again, we'll say this forever, and that is personal responsibility. I've had people that debate with me on a regular basis about, should a person, are there excuses that can be made for a person who fails to bear their own personal level of responsibility? And I'm always on the side that says, no. I mean, once you become grown, if your brain works normally and you're not mentally deranged, you pretty much know right from wrong. I mean, we all know you can't just walk in the store and take something out of there without paying for it. I mean, again, unless you're just deranged. We all know that you can't just walk down the street and for no reason get a baseball bat and just go hit somebody in the head with it and kill them. We know that you can't just go and get in somebody else's car that doesn't belong to you and just take it and drive it like ain't nothing ever going to happen. So the majority of us human beings know right from wrong. That's where personal responsibility comes in. It's knowing what the right things are to do and then putting yourself in a position to do those things, to make those right decisions. Now, when it comes to us, I'm talking about us black men, black males. We are the ones that are being attacked in the nation by white people. They'll somehow excuse the black woman. They'll just call her, a little hood rat and let her go, or they'll call her a gold digger and they won't address her issues any further. But for the black male, he must remain the target of attack. He must remain the enemy. So white people have us as the reason why society is up in arms in every way. It's the black male's fault. You have these dumbass white people who commit crimes dressed up as black people. You have white people that kill their kids and say it was a black person that carjacked them and did it. This woman, Susan Smith. I remember her story because I was in the media covering it. She took her little babies, little white woman, took her babies, put them in the back seat of a car, and pushed the damn car in the river and said that some black man carjacked her. I remember this doctor in Boston killed his wife, threw her off the Boston Bridge. He said that some black man carjacked him and they did it. And what's so sad about this is the police, rather than really investigate the story, simply started going to look for black men to arrest. Where is the personal responsibility on their end? Well, you're not going to really get any personal responsibility from them because they are the ones who are in power. They're the ones who are looking for someone to blame. So then it becomes on us for our own blackness to develop our own levels of personal responsibility. And one of the things I thought about was President Barack Obama. I know he addressed Morehouse last year, like when that graduating class was graduating. He addressed them, and he was pointing out to them about what he felt was personal responsibility. So, Brother Patrick, I just want to get your input on what you think about what he had to say. Was he way off? Was he sounding kind of like a quote-unquote Uncle Tom himself when he made these statements, or was he genuine? He said, we know that too many young men in our community continue to make bad choices. Growing up, I made a few myself. And I have to confess that sometimes I wrote off my own failings as just another example of the world trying to keep a black man down. But one of the things you've learned over the last 4 years, again, he's addressing this graduating class of black men, is that there's no longer any room for excuses. I understand that there's a common fraternity creed here at Morehouse, and that is excuses are the tools of the incompetent, used to build bridges to nowhere and monuments to nothingness. We've got no time for excuses, not because the bitter legacies of slavery and segregation have vanished entirely. They haven't. Not because racism and discrimination no longer exist. That's still out there. It's just that in today's hyper-connected, hyper-competitive world, with a billion young people from China and India and Brazil entering the global workforce alongside you, nobody's going to give you anything that you haven't earned. And whatever hardships you may have experienced because of your race, they pale in comparison to the hardships previous generations endured and overcame. And those were excerpts from President Barack Obama's address last year to the Morehouse graduating class. So where do you think he stands in that? Did it sound sincere? Did it sound genuine? Was he making some valid points? Let me know what you think.
I do think the president made a lot of valid points, and I think black people knows he made a lot of valid. I think and it's always interesting when you hear the president speak, because him and his wife can both say things and black people will love it, and then white people will say the exact same things and black people will hate it. And in the same sense, there are a lot of black people that take what he said out of context. And like I say all the time, I'm not the biggest Obama supporter, but I am fair. I like to believe I'm fair. And I really don't think he said anything too out of line, or anything that we didn't already know, or that we haven't said before. We have to get off of this, and what I took it as is that we have to get off of beating up on the society and begging the society to take part and to develop a sense of social and collective consciousness, and to have or display some form of social responsibility without taking on any personal responsibility ourselves. You have people who do want a handout, and a lot of them are in the pro-black community. I mean, there's no other way around it. That's what it is, because things aren't going great in their life. They're looking for something to blame or target, and they target the dominant white society, and that's how they deal with their own personal failures. That is very true. And we can't skate around that. We can't skirt it. We can't dress it up. We can't, we have to face that aspect of the situation we're in. And that aspect is, if black people were behaving and doing the things that we needed to be doing collectively as a group, then it wouldn't really matter what white people were doing. Not in the manner of what they're doing in today's terms. I mean, I could see if we were moving and they passed laws to shut us down, like they're doing with the with voting rights. Okay, that's legitimate. But if we're going into business and they're passing laws to shut down black businesses, or they're doing things to largely disproportionately affect black businesses on a massive scale, that's one thing. But right now, if you look at the numbers, black people aren't supporting black businesses like they should. Black businesses aren't supporting black people like they should. Black schools aren't supporting black curricula and black education like they should. No, there's this huge segment of black culture that is largely irresponsible and is largely blaming the dominant white society for being irresponsible. We have to own up to that. That's something that and I think that's what the president was getting at. We do have to own up to that aspect of our culture that says that because of slavery, I shouldn't have to work. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand that mind state. I do. I get it. But I also see that it's not very beneficial. Not for us, not for the dominant society, but primarily not for us. That's not beneficial for us because eventually, even if they were to right the ship per se and give us reparations or do whatever it is that we demand that they do to right the ship, at that point, if we did not have any iota of work ethic or cultural responsibility ingrained into us, things would still fall back into the state that they're in right now, or even worse, back into the states that they were prior to racism going underground. So, and I do realize, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, he don't blah, blah, blah. I do realize that there is a large majority of black America that is trying to be successful. They're very socially responsible. They're personally responsible. They're doing what they have to do. But when I talk about these things, I'm talking about as a collective, because people don't understand that racism is a cultural thing. And as a collective, culturally, we're under attack. Culturally, we're not doing what we need to be doing. Culturally, individually, we're doing what we need to do in large quantities to assimilate and to be successful in the dominant white society. But we're not doing anything to instill any sense of racial or ethnic pride into black children other than telling them to be white. So culturally, we are being very irresponsible. Those in the pro-black community that keep demanding America, 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 and never ever address black folk are being irresponsible, and we have to address that irresponsibility. Black people, and I'm going to say this again, black people nowadays do not have to live in the state that we're currently living in. We live there because we're just as apathetic as the dominant white society is towards our own plight. That's point blank, period. We are just as lazy and lackadaisical as they are when it comes to dealing with black issues. Matter of fact, even more so, because they don't want to be uncomfortable, and we don't want to make them uncomfortable, which would make us uncomfortable. So when it comes to dealing with the cultural aspect, there is that. When it comes to dealing with the business aspect, we really have to sit down and take a look at the fact that black businesses are not in any of the sectors that involve creating wealth. There are, when you look at the numbers for mining, the numbers for black businesses involved in the mining sector are so minuscule that they can't be reported. When you look at wholesale distribution, when you look at distribution in general, even when you look at construction, when you look at things that have to deal with creating, you see not a lot of black people in those fields, percentage-wise. But then when you look in the fields that deal in retail or deal in all these other types of things where you're making money, but you're also making somebody else money at the same time, normally making them more money than you're making yourself, we explode in those fields.
Yeah, like liquor stores and hair salons.
Exactly, and that's exactly what I'm getting at. I didn't want to say it directly, but you said it directly. But we explode in those fields. We explode in the fields where we can make somebody else money and make a little bit of change for ourselves. So we have to deal with, and that's what I took from it, we really have to deal with the personal responsibility side of this black experience. We need to come to terms with it. We need to face up to it. We need to realize that every black person you see in poverty, don't blame the government for them, because you as a black person, you have a hand in that as well, just like they have a hand in their own being in the situations they're in. We understand there are some extenuating circumstances. I've been in a few myself. Everybody gets down on their luck. But we still have to acknowledge, just like I have to acknowledge the fact that when I was down on my luck, I made decisions and I did things that weren't appropriate for me, that I shouldn't have done, that I knew going in that weren't smart decisions, and I went ahead and did them anyway. Other people have to acknowledge that about themselves. I think the crutch, though, or the key is not to blame people too harshly for their own mistakes if they're trying. Now, if somebody's not trying, then you point at personal responsibility and you keep it moving. Right. But if somebody's trying, then, you give them a hand. But I think largely what the president said, I agree with it. And I think we have to deal with and address this personal responsibility monster. I mean, it's real.
No question about it. And here's the thing about it. Now, we're not saying, I know I'm not saying in any way, and you're not saying, nor was the president suggesting that if you're a young black male and you grew up in a neighborhood where you might get shot, on your way to school, where the educational system is broke down and dilapidated, and where you're being racially profiled at every corner that you go to, and then when you go home, there's no food in the house. We know that there are some extraordinary levels of achievement that you would have to overcome in order to succeed. And we recognize that. However, what we're saying is that you still should make the attempt. Don't just say, well, that's just too much for me to overcome. I'm just going to go ahead and sell drugs and kill people and lay with whoever I want and just be a fool. So what we're asking for is the personal responsibility not to be blamed on the racism that Jim Crow established and that still continues today. What we're saying is make the attempt. And it's the same thing no matter who you are. You can make the excuse that, well, not everybody's going to make the decisions you make. However, you can't get away from the fact that you know right from wrong just for yourself. You see, that doesn't have anything to do with decisions I make, decisions you make, decisions the next person makes. Just you, yourself. You know what is right and you know what is wrong. And you know what you should be striving for and what you fail to strive for because you feel that's just too hard for me to do. Some of the brothers that sell drugs actually have some serious knowledge. I mean, they are smart men, but they channel the brains in the wrong way. Instead of saying, well, I'm going to attack society at this intellectual level, and I'm going to go ahead and strive to make it this way in corporate America and get my own business established, they take into what I think is just the easy way out. It's the lazy way out. It's saying, hey, it's just easier for me to grab these drugs and go and sell them to these drug addicts than it is for me to put my mind to work. And that is where I truly blame them, because that's a decision that you personally made. And you can't tell me, you can argue it, but you can't tell me that somebody forced you to sell drugs. It's just so rare that somebody would put you in a position where you are forced, to sell drugs where they're going to kill you. So I'm not going to buy into that. So it's 1:59 now. We're getting ready to wrap the show up again. We have talked about Jim Crow, and the question was, are we still feeling the effects of Jim Crow? And the consensus, at least with Patrick and myself, is that we do think that there are still some effects that are being felt as a result of Jim Crow. And then when it comes to personal responsibility, we are on the side, along with the lines of what the president is and others, that, we can overcome our odds and our obstacles. I was raised by a single mother. My dad died when I was 6 days old. So here's this grieving mother who has to raise two little black boys, and she cleaned people's houses. She worked in the cotton field when I was born. We had, sometimes it was hard to get food and all that, but here I am, at 52 years old, not in jail, not on drugs, not in prison. I don't have babies spread out all over the country. So I think that, personal responsibility clearly is doable. You just have to be the kind of person that says, I'm going to make that choice to be personally responsible. So having said that, Brother Patrick, you got any last words before we close it out?
Make sure you guys head on over to urbanintellectuals.com/members and become a member for $24 a year. Or you can donate at /donate. Make sure you stop by /radio to check out the other radio broadcasts. Brother Banks has an awesome After Dark show Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And that show runs at 10 p.m. Central Time, 11 p.m. Eastern. And that's a very good show, an hour of old school classics. On Wednesdays at 6:30 Central Standard Time, we have the Freedom Train, where Brother Joseph Ward interviews the doers, the movers and shakers in the black community. That's a very good show. On Saturdays at 11 a.m. or 10 p.m. or 10 a.m. Central Standard Time, we have Great Black Speeches, where we play some of the speeches from yesteryears, Ballad or the Bullet, Over the Mountain, and a couple other, you name it, we play it. So definitely there is a lot going on in the UI universe. So head on over to, again, www.urbanintellectuals.com. and check us out.
And with that, this has been Brother Patrick Irvine and Terry Banks filling in for Brother Jalal Tariq and Real Talk on UrbanIntellectuals.com.